At 72 years old,
Look,
Ruth
Roseanne,
Ann
look at the
Miller had built a
butterfly.
world from
That's a
the
beauty,
ashes of
Lily.
betrayal.
Enjoy the
A
day,
hidden
sweetheart.
paradise nestled deep in
It's
the
all
rugged
right, Lily.
foothills
We'll
of
figure
Oregon's
this out.
Cascade Range. Here, among the towering Douglas
Grandma?
firs and thriving gardens, her 6-year-old granddaughter Lily chased butterflies, her laughter echoing a freedom Ruth had fought for with her own 2 hands. But this sanctuary of peace was born from an act of unimaginable cruelty. Just 16 months prior, Ruth and a then 4-year-old Lily were left for dead on the shoulder of a desolate road by Ruth's own daughter-in-law. Their belongings were 2 cheap suitcases, and their entire fortune was a crumpled $48 tucked into an old leather wallet. Abandoned and invisible, they walked into the deepening twilight with nothing but a sliver of hope. That walk led them to a forgotten house, a structure so consumed by nature, it seemed to be waiting for them, holding a secret legacy of resilience that would give Ruth the strength not just to survive, but to reclaim her life. It's a story of how the deepest wounds can lead to the most beautiful destinations. We love seeing how far these stories travel, so before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. It's always incredible to see our community span the entire globe. As you settle in for Ruth's journey, if her story of resilience already resonates with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It truly helps us continue to bring these narratives to light. Now, we want to address something many of you have mentioned in the comments. The digital presenter you might be seeing. We read everything you write, and we understand that for many of you it feels impersonal and you don't enjoy it. We want to be transparent about why we're using it. Recently, YouTube has been changing its policies, and many channels like ours that used to use different narration methods have been removed without warning. This is our way of ensuring we can keep sharing these stories with you. We are constantly looking for better alternatives, but for now, this is what allows our team to continue its work. We also want to be clear that every single one of our stories is born from the minds of our dedicated human writers. We use AI as a powerful assistant in our creative process, but the heart, the soul, and the emotional core of every narrative comes from a real person who cares deeply about the story. Your support allows that human creativity to thrive. The image of Ruth's flourishing homestead, a testament to the power of the human spirit, is the end of her story. It is a destination earned through grit, tears, and the quiet refusal to be broken. But to truly understand the depth of her victory, to feel the cold despair that made this warmth possible, we must go back. We must travel back 16 months from this picture of peace, back to a cold, late autumn day when Ruth's world didn't just crumble, but was deliberately shattered by the very people she should have been able to trust. Her journey didn't begin with the first seed she planted in her new garden, but in the sterile, lemon-scented living room of her daughter-in-law's house, where the air was thick with unspoken greed and the groundwork for her exile was being meticulously laid. This is the story of how a woman who had given everything was left with nothing, only to discover that nothing was the one thing she needed to find herself. Ruth Ann Miller's life had been a masterclass in the art of making do, a long and quiet testament to the idea that love was not a feeling, but an action. She was a woman built from the soil of the Oregon earth she so dearly loved. Decades earlier, a full scholarship to study botany at a state university lay on her kitchen table, a crisp paper promise of a life filled with scientific names and academic pursuits. But then there was a young farmer with kind eyes and calloused hands, a man who spoke of building a life, not just a career. She chose the farmer. She chose to give up the formal study of plants to learn their secrets firsthand, turning a patch of rugged land into a thriving family farm. Together, they didn't just build a house. They built a world a place where the seasons dictated the rhythm of their days, and their wealth was measured in full canning jars and the laughter of their only son, Mark. Her hands, which could have been delicately handling slides under a microscope, instead learned the heft of a spade, the prick of a thistle, and the gentle weight of a newborn child. She never once looked back on that paper promise with regret, because she believed she had chosen the richer life. Her son, Mark, was the center of that life, a bright, energetic boy who grew up with the smell of turned earth in his clothes. But the farm that was a paradise to Ruth was a cage to him. He dreamed of uniforms and far-off places, a life of structure and purpose that the sprawling, unpredictable nature of farming could never offer. When he announced his desire to attend a prestigious military academy, the tuition was a figure so impossibly large it seemed to belong to another world. There was only one way. With a quiet ache in her heart, Ruth and her husband walked the fields to the most fertile section of their property, the gently sloping southern pasture that always caught the best light. They sold it. They signed the papers that amputated a piece of their history to graft a future onto their son. Ruth watched Mark stand straighter in his new uniform, his gratitude genuine, but his understanding of the sacrifice incomplete. She had pruned a part of her own roots so that he could be transplanted into a different kind of soil, hoping he would thrive there. It was what a mother did. You gave the best parts of your world to your children so they could build their own. The years that followed tested that philosophy in fire. A stroke stole her husband's words and the strength from his limbs, leaving him a prisoner in his own body. The vibrant farmer who had wrestled stumps from the ground now struggled to hold a spoon. For 5 long years, Ruth became his hands, his voice, his memory. Her world shrank to the 4 walls of their farmhouse. Friends stopped visiting, their discomfort a palpable presence in the room. Her own health began to fray at the edges, her sleep measured in 2-hour increments between his needs. There were offers of care facilities, of professional help, but Ruth refused them all. This was the man she had built a life with, the other half of her own story. She would not let his final chapters be written by strangers in a sterile, unfamiliar room. She cared for him at home, washing him, feeding him, and sitting with him in the long, silent hours, until the very end. When he finally passed, a part of Ruth went with him, and the silence he left behind was a physical presence in the house. She had given everything to her marriage, right up to the last breath. It was the only way she knew how to love. Then came the phone call that shattered the quiet grief she was navigating. Her son, Mark, killed in a training exercise. The news was a physical blow, a void that opened up in her life, so suddenly and completely that she could barely breathe. In the days that followed, she found herself in the alien landscape of her daughter-in-law's home, a pristine suburban house that smelled of chemical lemons and air freshener, an environment designed to erase any trace of messy, unpredictable life. At the funeral reception, 41-year-old Brenda Miller, Mark's widow, performed her grief with a theatricality that chilled Ruth to the bone. She was surrounded by her own family, accepting condolences with a sorrow that seemed perfectly rehearsed. Ruth, meanwhile, felt invisible, her own monumental loss an awkward footnote in Brenda's drama. Her one anchor in this disorienting world was her 4-year-old granddaughter, Lily, a small, silent child with her father's serious, dark eyes. Ruth held Lily's hand, a quiet promise passing between them, a vow to protect this last, precious piece of her son. In that cold, lemon-scented house, Ruth's focus narrowed to a single point: the survival of this child. Just 1 week after they buried her son, Ruth was summoned to the dining room table. It wasn't an invitation. It was a subpoena. On one side sat Brenda, her expression a mask of strained patience. Beside her sat her father, 68-year-old Gary Sykes, a man whose presence filled the room with a sense of bloated patriarchal authority. They didn't offer her coffee. They didn't ask how she was. Gary slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood of the table. "This just makes it clean," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Brenda needs to start over. She can't do that with complications." Ruth looked at the paper. It was a legal document, dense with jargon, but the meaning was brutally clear, a relinquishment of her grandparental rights. She looked up, not at the paper, but at the woman who had married her son. "Lily is not a complication," Ruth said, her voice quiet but steady. "She is your son's daughter." Brenda sighed, a dramatic, put-upon sound, and looked at the ceiling. "Oh, here we go," she muttered, as if dealing with a tiresome inconvenience. "I knew she'd make this difficult." Brenda then leaned forward, her tone shifting to one of condescending explanation, as if speaking to a child. "Look, Ruth," she said, her words sharp and quick. "Mark is gone. The money from his benefits is all I have. I can't afford to raise a child. It's that simple." The lie hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The life insurance payout was substantial, a fact Brenda seemed to think Ruth was too old or too naive to comprehend. "I will raise her," Ruth countered, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "I just need a little help until I can." But Brenda cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand, a gesture that erased Ruth and her plea from existence. "That's not how this works," she snapped. "I'm the widow. It's my call. This is what's happening." In the ensuing silence, the only sound was the incessant, unnerving click-clack of Brenda's long fingernails as she began typing on her smartphone, a tiny machine gun of indifference that underscored the cold, corporate nature of the cruelty being dispensed. The next morning, Brenda handed Ruth 2 cheap, battered suitcases from the attic. "Pack whatever you and Lily can fit," she instructed, her tone brisk and businesslike. As Ruth numbly folded the few clothes she had, placing Lily's favorite worn teddy bear on top, she could hear Brenda in Mark's old study down the hall. Her voice was loud, intentionally carrying through the house. She was on the phone with her bank, her words dripping with excitement as she discussed activating the full benefit account and inquired about the total liquidity of the principal. She was deliberately making sure Ruth overheard the confirmation of the large sum of money, a final, cruel twist of the knife. It was a performance designed to underscore Ruth's powerlessness, to make it clear that this exile was motivated by nothing more than pure, uncomplicated greed. Ruth paused, her hand resting on a small framed photo of Mark in his uniform, and the full weight of the betrayal settled upon her. She wasn't just being discarded. She and her granddaughter were being erased from the ledger so the assets could be liquidated. The drive was a silent study in deliberate apathy. Gary drove, his eyes fixed on the road, his face a stony mask. Brenda sat in the passenger seat, her world confined to the glowing screen of her phone. In the back, Lily, strapped into her car seat, began to cry, a soft, frightened whimper that grew in intensity. The sound was a desperate plea for comfort in a car devoid of any. Ruth reached over, trying to soothe the terrified child, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Brenda, annoyed by the interruption to her scrolling, didn't turn around. She didn't speak. She simply turned up the car radio, filling the vehicle with the loud, vapid thump of pop music, a wall of meaningless sound designed to drown out the sound of her own daughter's distress. The music was a declaration. Your fear is an inconvenience. Your sorrow does not register. You do not matter. The act was so profoundly heartless, it felt like a physical blow, leaving Ruth breathless in the oppressive, manufactured cheerfulness of the song. As the miles passed, Ruth watched the familiar landscape of suburbia, manicured lawns, strip malls, and traffic lights, melt away. It was replaced by something wilder, a dense and unfamiliar forest of towering Douglas firs and tangled undergrowth that pressed in on the two-lane road. The sky, once a pale, washed-out blue, deepened into the bruised purples and oranges of a late autumn sunset. With a dawning sense of horror, Ruth realized they were not being taken to a bus station. They were not being driven to a shelter or a distant relative's home. The direction they were heading, deep into the rural foothills of the Cascade Range, led to nowhere. It led to logging roads and forgotten towns. It led to places where people could get lost. The question, "Where are we going?" pulsed in her mind, a frantic, silent drumbeat of terror. She looked at Lily, whose tear-streaked face was now quiet, her eyes wide with confusion, and knew she had to be strong. But the empty road spooling out before them offered no comfort, only the chilling certainty that they were being taken somewhere to be abandoned. The car finally pulled over onto a muddy shoulder, the engine cutting out with a suddenness that made the ensuing silence feel deafening. "This is it," Gary said, his first words in over an hour. He got out, opened the trunk, and pulled out the 2 suitcases, setting them down in the wet dirt with a dull thud. Brenda remained in the car, a shadowy figure against the dying light. Ruth, moving as if in a dream, unbuckled a sleeping Lily from her car seat and lifted her out, the child's small, warm body a fragile anchor in a world that had come unmoored. She stood in the dirt, clutching the child, and looked at Brenda, a silent, desperate appeal in her eyes. "Brenda, please," she whispered, her voice raw. "Don't do this, not to her." For a moment, Brenda looked at them in the rearview mirror. Then, her expression as flat and empty as a winter sky, she spoke. "Don't try to find us," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "This chapter is closed." It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. With that, she turned her attention forward. As Gary got back into the driver's seat, Brenda glanced at her reflection in the mirror, briefly checking her makeup, a gesture of such stunningly casual narcissism that it stole the air from Ruth's lungs. The engine roared back to life. Gary didn't even look at them as he pulled the car back onto the asphalt, the tires spitting gravel that stung Ruth's ankles. Just before they sped away, the passenger window rolled down. It wasn't Brenda. It was Gary. He didn't speak. He simply tossed a half-empty plastic water bottle into the ditch near Ruth's feet, a final act of contempt, like discarding a piece of trash. Then the car was gone, its red tail lights shrinking into the distance until they were swallowed by the vast, deepening twilight. Ruth stood alone on the side of the road, the cold mud seeping through her thin shoes, with a sleeping child in her arms, and the profound, absolute silence of being left for dead. For a long moment, there was only the profound, ringing silence left behind by the departed car. The world seemed to hold its breath, the vibrant hues of the sunset, a cruel, beautiful mockery of the ugliness that had just transpired. Ruth stood motionless, the weight of a sleeping Lily in her arms, a fragile, precious anchor against a tide of disbelief. The cold air, sharp with the scent of pine and wet asphalt, filled her lungs, and with it, the full, crushing weight of what had happened. They had done it. They had actually done it. She looked down at the muddy shoulder, her eyes catching on a flash of painful, pointless beauty, the last rays of light glinting off a shard of broken glass. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, and yet it felt like a perfect metaphor for her shattered world. A wave of cold, black despair washed over her, the sheer, calculated injustice of it a physical weight that threatened to buckle her knees and send her sinking into the cold, slick mud that was already seeping into her thin shoes. For a fleeting, tempting moment, she entertained the thought of simply sitting down, of giving up. What was the point? They had won. But then the small body in her arms stirred. Lily, roused from her exhausted sleep by the sudden chill, began to shiver, her small hands clutching the fabric of Ruth's coat. The child wasn't crying, not yet. She was looking around at the towering, indifferent trees and the darkening sky with a confusion that was almost worse than fear. Her voice, when it came, was a tiny, clear whisper that cut through the fog of Ruth's despair like a beacon. "Are we lost, Grandma?" That simple, direct question, stripped of any guile or accusation, was a jolt to Ruth's system. She looked down at the pale, trusting face, the dark eyes that were a perfect copy of her son's, and something inside her shifted. This wasn't about her. It wasn't about the betrayal, the money, or the monumental injustice. It was about this child. She was not just Ruth Ann Miller, a discarded old woman. She was Grandma. She was the entire world, the sun and the moon and the shelter from the storm, for this one small, shivering soul. In that instant, the temptation to surrender evaporated, burned away by a fierce, primal love that was older and more powerful than any despair. Looking down the empty road one way, then the other, she saw only darkness and uncertainty. Forward was not a direction. It was an act of faith. She gently smoothed Lily's hair back from her forehead, her own hand trembling slightly. She forced a strength into her voice that she did not feel, a calm that was the most profound lie she had ever told. "No, sweet girl," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "We're not lost. We're on an adventure." The word felt absurd on her tongue, a hollow sound in the vast, empty wilderness. But Lily's eyes, which had been wide with worry, now held a flicker of curiosity. An adventure. That was something from her storybooks. Ruth gently set Lily on her feet, holding her hand tightly, and then turned to the two battered suitcases. They felt impossibly heavy. She picked one up, then the other, the cheap plastic handles digging into her fingers. Her mind, which had been screaming in a silent chorus of "Why?" now focused on a single, quiet phrase, a mantra she didn't know she had until it was there. Just the next thing, Ruth. Just do the next thing. And the next thing was to walk, away from the spot where they were left, away from the life that was stolen, and into the deepening unknown twilight of the hills. The first hour of walking was a journey into a different world, one where the rules of civilization had been rescinded. The paved road gave way to a cracked and potholed surface, and soon they were on a dirt track that was more mud than earth. The towering Douglas firs on either side of the road were no longer just trees. They were silent, colossal sentinels, their dark forms blotting out the last of the twilight and creating a tunnel of near-absolute blackness. The air grew colder, and the silence was a living thing, broken only by the squelch of their shoes in the mud, Ruth's ragged breathing, and the unnerving snap of a twig in the unseen forest. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every shadow seemed to move. Ruth's arms ached from the weight of the suitcases. Her back screamed in protest, but she kept moving. Her focus narrowed to the few feet of ground visible in front of her. She talked to Lily in a low, steady voice, pointing out the stars that were beginning to appear in the gaps between the trees, turning the terrifying darkness into a planetarium. It was a performance for an audience of one, but it was also for herself, a way to keep the encroaching panic at bay. Just as a rhythm of exhausted, plodding movement had set in, the nature of their ordeal changed once again. A cold drop of water hit Ruth's cheek, then another and another. Within minutes, a steady, chilling drizzle had turned into a cold, driving rain. The kind of persistent, bone-soaking Oregon rain that seemed to fall with a personal vengeance. The temperature plummeted. Lily, whose small legs were already struggling, began to cry in earnest, her sobs lost in the sound of the downpour. Hypothermia was no longer an academic concept. It was a clear and present danger, a stalking predator in the cold, wet dark. The dirt track dissolved into a slick, treacherous river of mud that grabbed at their ankles, threatening to pull them down with every step. Hope, which had been a fragile ember, was being systematically extinguished. It was in this moment of absolute, bottomless despair, when Ruth was certain they would be found in the morning, frozen in the mud, that her foot caught on something hard and metallic beneath the layers of fallen leaves and ivy. She stumbled, nearly dropping a suitcase, and looked down, her eyes trying to pierce the gloom. There, half buried in the undergrowth at the side of the track, was a glint of rusted metal. It wasn't a rock or a root. It was man-made. Curiosity, a feeling she thought had been washed away by the rain, surged within her. Setting down the suitcases, she knelt, her hands pushing through the slick, wet leaves and tangled ivy. Her fingers closed around a cold iron bar. It was a gate, an old, forgotten gate. So consumed by nature, it had become part of the forest floor. With a surge of adrenaline, she pulled. It resisted, groaning in protest, but with the desperation of a drowning woman, she heaved again. There was a screech of rusted metal, and a section of the ivy wall swung inward, revealing not just more forest, but a path. It was faint, nearly invisible, little more than a depression in the earth, but it was undeniably a path, leading away from the road and deeper into the woods. Without a second thought, she grabbed the suitcases and Lily's hand and plunged through the opening, leaving the open road behind for the promise of this hidden way. The path was a tunnel through time. Overgrown rhododendrons and vine maples formed a canopy that muffled the sound of the rain, creating an eerie, insulated silence. They walked for what felt like another mile, the path climbing steadily, until it opened into a small, natural clearing. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a house. It was a dark shape against the even darker gloom, a low, single-story structure that seemed to have grown from the earth itself rather than being built upon it. It was so covered in ivy and moss that it looked more like a geological feature than a dwelling. The roof sagged in the middle. A porch had collapsed on one side, and the windows were dark, empty eyes. By all accounts, it should have been terrifying. But to Ruth, soaked and shivering, and at the very end of her strength, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was shelter. It was a chance. She led Lily up the 3 rickety steps to the front door, her heart pounding. There was no lock, only an old-fashioned thumb latch. She pushed it, expecting it to be rusted shut. It moved, The door swung inward with a low groan, releasing a breath of air that was cool and close, but blessedly dry. They stumbled inside, and Ruth pushed the door closed, shutting out the sound of the rain. For a moment, they stood in absolute darkness, their lungs filling with the smell of the house. It was a complex, layered aroma, a history in scent. There was the bass note of damp, rich earth, the smell of a place slowly returning to the soil. Over that was the sharp, musty odor of decaying leaves and the dry, papery scent of mouse nests and long-forgotten books. It was the smell of time itself, of a life paused and abandoned decades ago. It wasn't clean, but it wasn't foul either. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the faint light filtering through the grime-caked windows, she could make out the shapes of furniture draped in dusty shrouds, a fireplace cold and black against one wall, and the ghostly outlines of pictures still hanging on the walls. It was a tomb, but it was a dry tomb. It was a start. The immediate, pressing need was for warmth. Lily was shivering uncontrollably now, her small face pale in the gloom. Ruth's first priority was to push back the cold that had settled deep in their bones. In one corner of the main room stood a large, cast-iron wood stove, a black, pot-bellied god of a forgotten era. Ruth's heart leaped. If she could get it lit, they would survive the night. Leaving Lily wrapped in her coat by the door, she began a desperate search. In a small, built-in wood box next to the hearth, she found a handful of dry, seasoned logs, left there by some long-dead owner, as if in anticipation of this very moment. She had fuel, but she needed tinder and a spark. From a collapsing bookshelf, she pulled a dry, brittle volume of poetry, whispering an apology to the long-gone author as she tore out a page. Then she rummaged in her coat pocket, her numb fingers fumbling with the clasp of her late husband's Zippo lighter. It was a silly, sentimental thing she'd carried for years. She flicked the wheel. Nothing. Again. A weak spark. Her heart sank. One more time, with all her will focused on the tiny wheel and flint. A strong, bright spark jumped, and the wick caught, a tiny, perfect flame dancing in the darkness. Carefully, she lit the corner of the crumpled page. The old paper caught instantly, a fragile orange glow that seemed impossibly bright. She fed the flame to the kindling she had arranged in the stove, twigs and scraps of bark she'd found in the wood box, and then added the smallest of the logs. For a tense minute, the flame flickered, threatening to die, and the stove gave off only a thick, acrid smoke. Ruth held her breath, her entire being focused on that one small act of creation. Then, with a soft whoosh, the draft caught. The smoke cleared, and a deep, satisfying roar filled the stove. Heat, real and palpable, began to radiate into the room, pushing back the damp and the dark. It was the most profound victory of Ruth's life. She hadn't been rescued. She hadn't been given a handout. In the dark and the cold, faced with absolute nothing, she had made fire. She had brought warmth back into her world with her own 2 hands. With the fire roaring and a fragile bubble of warmth established in the room, Ruth could finally tend to her granddaughter. She stripped off Lily's wet clothes and her own, wrapping them both in the 2 dry coats from the suitcases, huddling together on the dusty floorboards in front of the stove. The heat soaked into their chilled bodies, and Lily's shivering slowly subsided, replaced by the deep, even breaths of exhausted sleep. Ruth watched her, her heart a painful knot of love and fear and a strange, fierce pride. The house was a wreck, they had no food, and the world outside was a hostile unknown. But in this one small circle of firelight, they were safe. She could hear the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. But now there was another sound, a soft, rhythmic pitter-patter, coming from the corner of the room. A leak, rain hitting the dusty attic floorboards above. It was a problem for tomorrow, a problem she would have the strength to face. She pulled Lily closer, the child's small head resting in the crook of her arm, and looked around the fire-lit room. The dancing flames threw long, distorted shadows that made the shrouded furniture look like sleeping giants. The house was old, and it was full of ghosts, but for the first time in a long time, Ruth didn't feel alone. She felt like she had stumbled into a story that was already in progress. As Lily slept, Ruth whispered into the warm, quiet dark, the words a promise to the sleeping child and a vow to herself. "It's just a big old dusty house, sweet girl," she murmured, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Nothing to be scared of. We're just like the pioneers in your storybook. We just have to be brave for a little while. Just do the next thing. That's all. Just the next thing." And as the stove pulsed with warmth and the rain drummed its endless rhythm on the roof, a strange sense of peace settled over her. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't hope. It was something harder, something more fundamental. It was the quiet, unyielding certainty that she had found solid ground. The first 3 weeks in the house were a silent, brutal triage, a battle fought not against people, but against the slow, inexorable decay of time. The first winter in the house was a fallow season for her heart, cold, silent, and seemingly lifeless. But under the surface, strength was gathering for the spring. Ruth learned the anatomy of the house, its groans and sighs, the places where the wind whistled through and the floorboards cried out. But survival depended on more than just shelter. It required tools, seeds, a way to build a future beyond the handful of logs in the wood box. After a month of subsisting on wild greens and the meager supplies from her suitcase, with her $48 stretched to its breaking point, Ruth knew she had to venture out. She left a sleeping Lily wrapped warmly by the fire and walked the 5 miles to the nearest town, a small, quiet place called Oak Run. Her destination was a dusty feed and hardware store, its paint peeling but its windows clean. She walked in, the jingle of a small bell announcing her arrival into a world that smelled of metal, oil, and dry grain. Her plan was simple: buy a box of nails and a packet of the cheapest vegetable seeds they had, then disappear back into the hills. Behind the counter stood Maria Flores, the 65-year-old owner of the store, a woman with kind, tired eyes and hands that showed a lifetime of work. Maria watched as Ruth, gaunt and weary but with an undeniable core of dignity, carefully counted out her few dollars for the seeds. She saw the way Ruth's eyes lingered on a sturdy shovel, the way she ran a hand over the smooth handle of an axe, a gesture of profound longing. She saw the silent, sleeping child Ruth had described leaving back at her place, and she understood. Maria, a widow herself whose children were long grown and gone, recognized the shape of a woman fighting a silent war. As Ruth was about to leave, Maria spoke, her voice warm but matter-of-fact. "The earth has credit for you," she said, waving off Ruth's confusion. She went into the back room and returned with a repaired shovel, a slightly rusted but still sharp axe, and a box of high-protein chicken feed. "You pay the earth back! You pay me back!" Maria insisted, pressing the tools into Ruth's hands. "Go on now." Ruth stood, speechless, tears welling in her eyes for the first time since the ordeal began. It was an act of such simple, profound kindness that it felt like a dam breaking inside her. She hadn't just been given tools, she had been seen. Returning to the homestead with the borrowed tools and a heart full of bewildered gratitude, Ruth felt a shift in the very air around her. She was no longer just a refugee hiding from the world. She was a partner to this land. The work began in earnest. The first task was water. The old hand-drawn map from the trunk had shown a well, and after a day of clearing brush, she found it, capped with a heavy stone lid. With Maria's axe, she fashioned a new lever for the rusted pump handle. For an hour she worked the handle, the screech of dry metal echoing in the clearing, until finally, with a shudder and a groan, the pump coughed up a stream of muddy water, then another, and then it ran clear. She cupped her hands under the spout, and the shocking, living cold of the well water was a baptism. It was a pure, elemental cold that made her feel viscerally alive, a taste of the deep, hidden life of the land itself. With water secured, she turned her attention to the house, patching the roof with tin salvaged from a collapsed shed, her movements slow but precise, learning the language of carpentry her husband had spoken. Each swing of the hammer was a declaration of permanence. As winter gave way to a wet, vibrant Oregon spring, Ruth turned her full attention to the soil. Using the spade from Maria, she began the back-breaking work of turning a patch of earth near the house, a space choked with thorny blackberry vines and a century of weeds. The work was a rhythmic, meditative cycle of thump-scrape, the sound of her hoe becoming her mantra. Her hands, which had once delicately tended roses in a suburban garden, now wrestled with rocks and ripped out stubborn roots. She felt like she had to find a place where her own roots, long ripped from the soil, could find purchase again. It was here she found her first wild harvest, a patch of sour blackberries, their flavor a jolt of intense, untamed life on her tongue. It was a gift from the land, a promise of what was to come. With Lily helping, her small fingers pressing the precious heirloom seeds from Elspeth's tin box into the dark, rich earth, Ruth planted her first real garden. It was an act of faith, a quiet prayer offered to the dirt. She was planting a future, one seed at a time. Weeks passed in a montage of labor. The sun grew warmer, the days longer. Lily, who had been a silent, clinging shadow, began to blossom. The homestead was the only home she truly remembered, a safe, magical world of birds and bugs and the rich smell of damp earth. She began to talk, then to chatter, then to sing, her laughter becoming the heartbeat of the house. Then, one morning, it happened. Ruth was weeding a row of carrots when she saw it, a tiny, vibrant, almost impossibly green leaf pushing its way through the soil. It was the first sprout from one of Elspeth's seeds, a tiny flag of victory. Ruth knelt, her rough fingers gently touching the fragile leaf, and a joy so pure and fierce it felt like a physical blow surged through her. It was proof, bursting from the ground, that even in the most barren-looking life, there can be abundance. The garden wasn't just giving them a promise of food, it was giving her back a piece of herself, the botanist she had set aside a lifetime ago. This was her laboratory, and the results were more profound than any academic paper. The leak in the attic had been a persistent, nagging problem, a soft pitter-patter on the old wood that was a constant reminder of the house's vulnerability. One rainy afternoon, armed with a piece of salvaged tin, Ruth finally resolved to fix it for good. She climbed the rickety ladder into the dusty, close air of the attic, the smell of old paper and time thick in her nostrils. The source of the leak was behind a large, dust-covered steamer trunk, a heavy, iron-bound relic from another era. As she struggled to move it, her hands gripping the cold leather straps, she noticed it wasn't locked. A faint curiosity stirred within her. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't truly explored the intimate history of the house. Now, with a moment's pause, she lifted the heavy lid. The hinges groaned in protest, and a puff of dry, stale air escaped. She peered inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She expected to find old clothes, perhaps moth-eaten blankets. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. "We know you're on the edge of your seat, and believe us, what Ruth found in that trunk would change everything. The resilience of the human spirit is an incredible thing. And if Ruth's journey is inspiring you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. It's a small click for you, but it means the world to us and allows us to keep sharing these powerful stories." Inside the trunk was not gold or jewels, but something infinitely more precious, a meticulously organized legacy. Stacked neatly were the journals of Elspeth McGregor, dated from 1922 to 1958, their pages filled with elegant, precise handwriting. Beside them, a large tin box held dozens of small, carefully labeled envelopes, heirloom seeds adapted over decades to this exact patch of land. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was the original notarized deed to the 20-acre property, registered to Elspeth McGregor, and a single, hand-drawn map. Ruth's hands trembled as she lifted the first journal. The texture of the pages was not brittle, but soft and fibrous, like old linen. Turning them felt like shaking hands with a ghost. Tucked inside the cover was a single-page letter, addressed to no one and everyone. She began to read the words of the woman who had walked this same path a century before her. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "this house has found you, and you have found it. It is a stubborn place, but it is good." Ruth's voice was a near whisper as she read the words aloud to the silent, dusty attic, the sound of the rain on the roof a gentle accompaniment. "I arrived here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a satchel of seeds. I leave it to you with the same. Do not be afraid of the silence. It is where you will hear yourself again. The soil is honest. It will give back what you put into it. This was my sanctuary. I hope it can be yours." A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on Ruth's cheek and fell onto the page. She was not an intruder. She was an heir. The discovery was a spiritual transfusion, a profound validation that echoed across the decades. She was not alone. She was the next woman who needed this land, and Elspeth, a botanist just like she had once dreamed of being, had left her a map, a mentor, and a blessing. The discovery of the journals and the deed lit a new fire in Ruth. It was no longer just about survival. It was about honoring a legacy. But the practicalities of the modern world soon intruded. One afternoon, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a man with a kind face and curious eyes. Ruth, wary and protective, stood with a hoe held like a weapon. The man held up his hands peacefully. He introduced himself as Samuel Sam Jones, a 75-year-old retired mail carrier and local history enthusiast who sometimes walked old routes for exercise. He'd seen the smoke from her chimney and was overcome with curiosity. "I'll be," he said, peering at the house with a smile. "I thought this place had fallen down 20 years ago. Elspeth McGregor's old homestead. She was quite a woman." He was not a threat. He was a historian, a keeper of stories. Ruth, sensing his genuine nature, slowly lowered the hoe. Over the next hour, sitting on the newly repaired porch, she told him a heavily edited version of her story and showed him the deed. Sam's eyes lit up. He peered at the old document over his spectacles, then looked at the thriving garden, and then back at Ruth. "Well now," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "According to this, and the fact that you've been living here, working the land, you're not trespassing, you're homesteading." He explained the legal principle of adverse possession in Oregon. Because the property was so old and forgotten, it had fallen off the county tax rolls. With the original deed and proof of continuous inhabitants, she could file a quiet title action and claim legal ownership. He brought out old county maps, showing her the exact property lines Elspeth had drawn. He gave her a name of a legal aid lawyer in a bigger town. He gave her a tangible path, a legal weapon to secure the sanctuary she was building. And for Lily, he brought a stack of picture books from his own grandchildren. With the legal process slowly, quietly moving in the background, Ruth's focus returned to the land with renewed vigor. The small garden patch exploded into a half-acre masterpiece of organization and abundance. Neat, terraced rows of tomatoes, squash, beans, and kale climbed the gentle slope behind the house. An herb garden near the kitchen door filled the air with the scents of rosemary and thyme. The rich, heady scent of the first tomato vine, warmed by the sun, was a perfume of success. The homestead, once being swallowed by the forest, now pushed back, a space of deliberate, productive beauty. Lily, now 5, had her own small plot where she grew radishes and marigolds, her hands as comfortable in the dirt as her grandmother's. The silent, fearful child was gone, replaced by a bright, curious girl whose laughter was the truest harvest of all. The garden soon produced more than they could possibly eat or preserve. Remembering Maria's kindness, Ruth had an idea. She filled a wooden crate with her most beautiful produce: glossy eggplants, vibrant summer squash, and bundles of fragrant basil. She carried it down to the main track and set up a small stand with a simple, hand-painted sign: "Vegetables, Honor Box." At first, only a few cars stopped, but the quality of the produce was undeniable. Word spread through Oak Run. People began making special trips up the winding road. She was no longer an unknown, a ghost in the hills. She became the lady with the amazing tomatoes. The honor box filled with crumpled bills and coins. One afternoon, Ruth walked the 5 miles back to Maria's store. She didn't just pay back the line of credit, she pressed a thick bundle of extra cash into Maria's hand. Maria tried to refuse, but Ruth was firm. "The earth paid me back," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Now I'm paying you." It was a transaction of mutual respect, a circle of kindness completed. The house itself transformed alongside the garden. The wooden walls, stripped of their suffocating ivy, were scrubbed clean and now glowed in the afternoon sun. Ruth trained flowering vines on new trellises, weaving life back into the structure. The collapsed porch was rebuilt, now featuring 2 sturdy rocking chairs she had repaired from the shed. Smoke curled from the chimney, not just with the promise of warmth, but with the scent of baking bread. The windows, once dark and empty, were now clean, and at night they glowed with the warm, steady light of oil lamps. Inside, the dusty shrouds were gone, replaced by colorful quilts Ruth had mended. Jars of preserved vegetables and fruits lined the shelves, their colors like jewels against the rough-hewn wood. The house was no longer a tomb or a temporary shelter. It was a home, breathing and alive, a testament to the fact that even the most broken things can be made whole again through love and labor. Lily's world was one of boundless magic. Her days were spent chasing butterflies through the tall grass, building fairy houses from moss and twigs, and listening to her grandmother's stories, not just from books, but stories of the land, of the plants, of Elspeth. She learned the names of the birds that visited their feeder, the difference between a Douglas fir and a western red cedar, and the secret, sweet taste of a sun-ripened berry picked straight from the vine. For her, the hardships of their arrival were a forgotten dream. This place of peace and productivity was the only reality she knew, a world built by her grandmother's strong, capable hands. The quiet hum of bees from the new hives Sam had helped them acquire, and the rhythmic clucking of the chickens Maria had given them, were the soundtrack to her childhood, a symphony of life reborn. With the money from the honor box, Ruth was able to afford a small battery-powered radio, their first real link to the outside world. It brought music and news into their quiet evenings, but more importantly, it was a symbol of their progress. They were not cut off. They were self-sufficient. They had moved from a state of desperate need to one of quiet abundance. Ruth's work ethic had become her prayer, and the land had answered. The garden didn't just bear food, it bore fruit in the form of dignity, independence, and a burgeoning sense of belonging. The process of leaving Brenda and her world behind had been a necessary pruning, cutting away the diseased branch so the rest of the tree could live. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, Ruth Ann Miller had not only reclaimed her life, she had cultivated a new one, richer and more resilient than anything she had ever known. The slow, steady rhythm of the seasons had lulled the homestead into a state of grace. The land was healed, the house was whole, and Lily was thriving. But in a world connected by invisible threads of information, no secret paradise stays hidden for long. A small local newspaper, doing a feature on the burgeoning farm-to-table scene in the region, discovered Ruth's honor box. The reporter, charmed by the story and amazed by the quality of the produce a local cafe was now buying, wrote a glowing piece he titled "The Ghost Garden of Oak Run." It was a story about resilience, about a mysterious woman in the hills who grew vegetables that tasted of the earth itself. The story was picked up by a popular Portland-based lifestyle blog, complete with beautiful photos of the terraced gardens and the rustic hand-painted sign. It was this blog post, shared across social media, that finally pierced the bubble of peace Ruth had so carefully built. In her sterile suburban apartment, miles away and a world apart, Brenda Miller saw the article on her laptop screen, her morning coffee forgotten. Her face, a mask of bored entitlement, twisted. It began with disbelief, then morphed into a dark, venomous rage. It was the rage of a thief who discovers the trinket they discarded was actually a diamond. The photos didn't show hardship, they showed beauty, productivity, and life. She didn't see an old woman barely surviving. She saw a valuable piece of real estate, a picturesque farmette that bloggers would pay a fortune for. The greed that had been lying dormant, sated by Mark's insurance money, awoke with a ravenous hunger. She immediately called her father. "She's alive!" she hissed into the phone, her voice tight with fury. "And she's sitting on a gold mine. Our gold mine." The arrival was an act of violation, a screech of tires on the gravel where the path met the road. A shiny black SUV, so new it still had the dealer's temporary plates, parked at an aggressive angle, its polished chrome glinting with an alien light in the soft afternoon sun. It was a machine built for clean, paved roads and suburban dominance, and it looked utterly obscene against the backdrop of the whispering Douglas firs. The doors opened, and out stepped Brenda and her father, Gary. They were dressed for a hostile takeover, not a walk in the country. Gary wore a crisp golf shirt and slacks, his face set in a grim, determined scowl. Brenda was a vision of urban aggression, her tight designer jeans tucked into bright red, high-heeled boots that were entirely unsuited for the terrain. They paused for a moment, taking in the scene. The air, which, to Ruth, was filled with the sweet scent of late summer flowers and the promise of rain, was to them just empty space. They were intruders, and the very land seemed to know it. They started up the path, their movements stiff and angry, their presence a discordant note in the symphony of the homestead. Their journey up the path was a silent, escalating comedy of errors. Gary, puffed with indignation, marched ahead, his expensive loafers slipping on the damp earth. But the true spectacle was Brenda. Her sharp stiletto heels, designed for polished floors and concrete, sank into the soft, dark soil with every step. She teetered, her arms flailing for balance, a look of pure fury on her face as she tried to navigate the gentle slope. The earth itself was refusing her a firm footing, pulling her down, staining her immaculate boots with the very substance she had tried to leave Ruth to die in. It was a perfect, unspoken metaphor. She did not belong here. Her world of hard surfaces and sharp angles had no purchase in this place of soft earth and living things. By the time they reached the clearing, their faces were flushed. Gary's with exertion, Brenda's with a combination of humiliation and rage. They stood at the edge of the garden, panting slightly, staring at the scene before them as if it were a hallucination. It was worse than the pictures. It was real. The homestead they found was not the derelict shack they had imagined. It was a picture of serene, self-sufficient beauty. The house was clean and solid, wreathed in flowering vines. The porch, which they vaguely remembered as a pile of rubble, was now a welcoming space, complete with 2 sturdy rocking chairs. And in one of those chairs sat Ruth Ann Miller. She was not the frail, defeated woman they had discarded. She was the calm center of this vibrant world, a bowl of beans in her lap, her hands moving with the steady, rhythmic grace of shelling them. Beside her, on a colorful quilt, a now 6-year-old Lily lay sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling in the warm air. The air smelled of baking bread from the house, and the faint, sweet scent of honey from the beehives buzzing quietly in the distance. The entire scene was a testament to life, to work, to peace. It was an undeniable, living rebuke to their act of destruction, and its very existence was an intolerable insult to them. They had meant for this story to end in tragedy, but it had stubbornly, defiantly become a triumph. Brenda found her voice first, attempting to cloak her fury in a thin veneer of false concern, the same saccharine tone she had used when planning her husband's funeral. "My God," she said, her voice high and strained as she surveyed the thriving garden, her eyes scanning it not with admiration, but with the cold calculus of a property appraiser. "You're actually living here. We saw an article. We were so worried. This can't possibly be safe for a child." She gestured vaguely at the peaceful scene, as if it were a den of wolves. Ruth didn't look up from her work. Her hands continued their steady rhythm, shelling another bean, placing it in the large ceramic bowl. The only acknowledgement she gave was a slight tightening of her jaw. She let the silence stretch, forcing them to stand in their discomfort. Finally, after a long, pregnant pause, she spoke, her voice low and even, not carrying a trace of fear or surprise. It was the voice of a woman who had been expecting this moment all along. "She's safer here," Ruth said, her eyes still on her hands, "than she ever was with you." The quiet finality of her words hung in the air, a wall they could not breach. Gary, always the enforcer, stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Now you listen here?" he blustered, pointing a finger at Ruth. "We have a lawyer. This property is part of Mark's estate." "It's legally Brenda's. You are trespassing and you will leave immediately." His voice was loud, accustomed to being obeyed, but here in the quiet clearing, it just sounded like noise. It was only then that Ruth stopped her work. She placed the half-shelled pod down, carefully, deliberately. Slowly, she stood up, her movements not those of an old woman, but of a queen rising from her throne. She was no longer stooped. Her posture was straight, her gaze level. She was taller than they remembered. Her voice, when she spoke again, was not loud, but it carried with a calm, devastating authority that cut through Gary's bluster like a scythe through dry wheat. "This property," she said, her eyes fixed on his, "has not belonged to anyone in your world for over 100 years. She took a single step forward, to the edge of the porch, so she was now looking down on them. Her gaze was unwavering, and it held the weight of all she had endured. "It belongs to a woman who built it with her own 2 hands," she continued, her voice resonating with a power they had never heard from her before. "A woman who understood the value of things. Something you know nothing about. You speak of lawyers and estates. I speak of soil and rain and work." She then shifted her gaze to Brenda, who flinched as if struck. "You abandoned a child on the side of a road for money. You left her to die. There is no court in the world, no piece of paper, no legal trick that will look at you and see anything but the rot in your heart." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with a cold, surgical precision, each one landing with the force of a hammer blow. The truth, spoken plainly and without fear, was a weapon they had no defense against. Brenda sputtered, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. The script had been flipped. She was supposed to be the one in charge, the one delivering ultimatums. "You have no idea what you're talking about!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "We'll have you thrown out of here! You'll have nothing!" Ruth watched her, her expression one of profound, weary pity. This was all they knew. Threats, money, taking things. It was the only language they spoke. "You threw me out once," Ruth replied, her voice dropping back to that quiet, unshakable calm. "It was the greatest gift you ever gave me. You sent me here, to a place where things grow." She paused, letting the words sink in, a final, devastating contrast. "You can go back to your world where things only get spent." Without another word, Ruth turned her back on them. It was the ultimate dismissal, an act of such profound indifference. It was more powerful than any curse. She walked to her front door, where a small, laminated document had been tacked to the wood. It had been there for months, a quiet statement of fact waiting for this very day. She had known they would come. It was the final judgment from the county court, the official decree of quiet title, declaring Ruth Ann Miller the sole, legal owner of the 20-acre property under the principle of adverse possession. She didn't have to point to it. She didn't have to say a word. Her calm confidence was all the explanation needed. She simply turned, looked past them toward the darkening woods, and delivered the final verdict on their shared history. "The adventure is over," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "You should go now." Defeated, humiliated, and utterly powerless, Brenda and Gary had no choice but to retreat. There were no more threats to make, no more leverage to apply. They had come to conquer and found themselves facing a fortress not of walls, but of unassailable moral right and legal fact. They stumbled back down the path. Brenda's red heels now caked and ruined with the rich, dark mud of the homestead. They didn't speak. The silence in their shiny, new SUV on the drive back was not the silence of apathy they had imposed on Ruth and Lily, but the thick, suffocating silence of total and complete failure. They had lost. Not to a lawyer, not to a fight, but to a quiet woman who had refused to be erased, a woman who had taken the nothing they had left her and spun it into a world so rich and whole it had no room for them in it. Their chapter in her life was, finally and irrevocably, closed. The story of what happened next in the world outside the homestead arrived not as a storm, but as a series of quiet ripples in the small town of Oak Run. Brenda, true to her nature, had ignored her own lawyer's counsel and pursued the frivolous lawsuit with a vindictive fury. The process was a slow, grinding machine that consumed money and time, and the local paper, which had once celebrated the ghost garden, now dutifully reported on the court proceedings. The narrative was impossible to spin. The facts were stark. A wealthy, younger woman attempting to use the courts to seize the home of her elderly mother-in-law, a woman she had already abandoned. Brenda's case was built on a foundation of greed, and it crumbled under the simple, unassailable weight of Ruth's quiet dignity and the clear letter of the law. The judgment was swift and absolute. Not only was her claim dismissed, but she was ordered to cover all of Ruth's legal fees, a final ironic twist of the knife she had tried to wield. The verdict was more than a legal defeat. It was a social and financial unraveling. The news that trickled back to Sam and Maria, and eventually to Ruth herself, painted a bleak picture of karmic justice. To fund the ill-fated legal battle, Brenda had been forced to sell the pristine suburban house that Mark's life insurance had paid for, downsizing to a cramped, joyless apartment. Her carefully curated circle of friends, who thrived on an image of effortless success, melted away, embarrassed by the public spectacle of her cruelty and failure. She was left with nothing but the sour company of her father, their relationship now curdled by resentment and blame. Gary's blustering authority had proven useless, and Brenda's entitled aggression had backfired spectacularly. They were trapped together in a small beige box of their own making, their world shrunken and silent. For Ruth, listening to the story from Maria one quiet afternoon, the news brought no sense of triumph, no satisfying surge of victory. It was simply information, a distant weather report from a land she no longer inhabited. Brenda and Gary had not been vanquished by her. They had been consumed by the very emptiness they had tried to cast her into. Back on the homestead, the seasons continued their steady, indifferent turning, measuring time not in court dates and legal fees, but in the slow greening and browning of the earth. The fall after the confrontation gave way to a cold, wet winter, and the land went to sleep under a thick, clean blanket of snow. But inside the house, life had never been more vibrant. The root cellar was a treasure chest of earthly jewels, deep orange squash, purple-skinned potatoes, and onions with skins like polished gold. The shelves of the pantry were lined with jars that held the captured sunlight of summer, the deep red of tomato sauce, the bright green of pickled beans, the amber of peach preserves. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was an ark, floating peacefully on a sea of white, carrying within it the promise of spring and the warmth of a life earned. The very air was different now, thick with the scents of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the slow-burning oak in the stove, and the constant comforting aroma of something good about to come out of the oven. The network of quiet kindness that had saved her had now blossomed into a true community. Maria's little hardware store, once struggling, was now a bustling hub. The cafe that bought Ruth's produce began buying from other local growers Maria recommended, creating a small but thriving local food economy. Maria and Ruth became the dearest of friends, spending long winter evenings by the fire, their comfortable silence punctuated by the click of knitting needles and the rustle of a seed catalog. Sam, the man with the maps, had found a new chapter for his life's passion. He began meticulously documenting the history of Elspeth McGregor and the homestead's rebirth, creating a small, self-published book for the local historical society. He became an adopted grandfather to Lily, bringing her not just books, but stories of the land, connecting her present to a deep and resilient past. Their lives, once quiet and solitary, had found a new, shared center in the woman and the garden they had helped to save. They had given her tools and knowledge, and in return, she had given them back a sense of purpose and belonging. But the most profound transformation was Lily, the small, silent, 6-year-old girl who had arrived as a ghost was now a force of nature. The homestead was the only world she truly knew, and it was a kingdom of endless wonder. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold air, her legs strong from climbing trees and running through the meadow. The fear that had once lived in her dark, serious eyes was gone, replaced by a bright, unclouded curiosity. She had her own small chores, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, helping her grandmother weed. But to her, they were not work. They were the natural rhythm of a life that made sense, a life where her small hands could make a real difference. She could name every bird that came to the feeder, identify the tracks of deer in the snow, and knew by the smell of the air when a storm was coming. She was a child of the earth, fluent in a language older than words, her laughter a constant, clear bell ringing through the quiet of the hills. One cold December afternoon, a full year after the confrontation, the first heavy snow of the season began to fall. Each flake a slow, perfect star descending upon the silent world. Inside the warm, bright kitchen, the air smelled of baking bread and the sharp, clean scent of the small Douglas fir they had decorated with pine cones and dried flowers. Ruth stood at a large, flowered wooden table, her hands, gnarled but sure, working a large mound of dough. Beside her on a stool stood Lily, her small face serious with concentration as she mimicked her grandmother's movements, pushing her own small hands into a lump of dough. "Am I doing it right, Grandma?" she asked, her voice clear and confident. "Is it right?" Ruth looked down, a slow, warm smile spreading across her face. "It's perfect, sweet girl," she said, her voice full of a love so deep it was a physical presence in the room. "You're a natural. You have good hands. Strong hands." In that moment, watching Lily's small, flour-dusted fingers press into the dough, an echo of her own life's work, a profound sense of peace settled over Ruth. It was a peace that went deeper than happiness, a quiet understanding that had taken a lifetime to earn. She thought of the woman she had been, the woman who had given up her own dreams to build a family, only to have that family try to erase her. She thought of the cold, desolate road, the feeling of being left with absolutely nothing. And she looked at the vibrant, laughing child before her, at the warm, safe home around them, at the life she had built not from a plan, but from the simple, desperate act of doing the next right thing over and over again. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her very bones, that her life had not been a series of sacrifices, but a long, slow gathering of strength for this one perfect moment. The camera of memory pulls back, away from the warm, laughing faces in the kitchen, moving slowly past the window pane where a single, perfect snowflake has landed. It drifts backward out into the cold, quiet evening, showing the house no longer as an abandoned shack, but as a beacon. Its windows glow with a warm, steady light, a single point of life and love in the vast, snow-covered, and utterly peaceful landscape of the Oregon hills. This is the mirror image of the story's beginning. Where once there were two small, lost figures dwarfed by a hostile and empty road, there is now a single, powerful light, a home that has become the very center of its own world. It is a testament, glowing in the deepening twilight, that the most profound darkness can lead to the most brilliant light. They were not lost on that road. They were simply on the long path home. As Ruth watched Lily's small hands, so full of life and promise, she had a final, clarifying thought, a truth that landed with the gentle weight of the falling snow. They didn't leave me with nothing, she realized, the words a quiet anthem in her soul. They left me with everything that matters. Her story is a powerful reminder that the end of one chapter is often the painful, necessary beginning of the one we were always meant to write. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the soil of our deepest wounds. We are so grateful to share these journeys of the human spirit with you, and we read every single one of your comments. If Ruth's story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel, giving this video a like, and sharing your thoughts below. It truly helps us to continue this work. This homestead, a sanctuary built of resilience and love, became a quiet legend in the hills of Oregon. It wasn't just a house, it was a living story, a place that proved that strength isn't about the absence of fear, but about taking the next step even when you're terrified. Ruth and Lily's life unfolded in the simple, profound rhythm of the seasons, planting, growing, harvesting, and resting. They had everything they needed and wanted nothing more. They had found their place. Their story reminds us that our foundations are not always built on what we are given, but often on what we are forced to build for ourselves. It shows that true wealth is not what you can accumulate, but what you can cultivate within yourself and in the world around you. Ruth Ann Miller's journey teaches a quiet but powerful lesson. It whispers that even after the most brutal pruning, new growth is possible, often stronger and more beautiful than before. Her life became a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to find its way back to the light, to put down roots in the most unlikely of places, and to flourish against all odds. Her story is a quiet reassurance that a home is not a place you are given. It is the place you have the courage to build. It's a reminder that even when we are left with nothing, we still possess the most powerful tools of all, our hands to work, our hearts to love, and the unyielding hope for a new dawn. The two women, one old and one young, continued to knead their dough side by side, their movements a silent, synchronized dance of creation. The warmth of the kitchen, the smell of the coming bread, the sound of the wind whispering through the tall firs outside. It was a symphony of simple, profound peace. Lily began to hum a small, happy tune, a melody of her own invention, and the sound filled the small spaces between the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the fire. Ruth closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the sound wash over her, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. This was the life she had chosen all those years ago when she set aside a scholarship for a farmer's hand. It had taken a lifetime of detours, of heartbreak and betrayal, but she had finally, truly arrived. The journey had been brutal, but the destination was, without a doubt, worth it. Every story of resilience lights a path for others, and Ruth's journey is a powerful beacon. It shows us that what looks like an ending can be a beginning in disguise, that being left for dead can be the catalyst to truly start living. Her legacy wasn't just in the thriving garden or the warm house, it was in the quiet strength she modeled for her granddaughter, and for all of us who have faced our own desolate roads. The courage to take that first step into the unknown, to believe in the possibility of a better place, is a seed we all carry within us. We hope Ruth's story encourages you to tend to your own garden, whatever form it may take. Thank you for being a part of our community and for allowing us to share these narratives of hope. Your presence here makes all the difference.